the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show.
I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. Now, as regular listeners will know, the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show is very much concerned with the music of the 50s, 60s, 70s and its roots. And today we're going to take a look at some of the more eerie events from that period on the dark side of rock and roll. Now, death is a regular visitor to the dark side of rock and roll. Plane car crashes, murders, suicide. We'll look at some of the more bizarre examples, perhaps where fate took a hand. Now, band managers are not always the band's genial friend. And we've got stories of decapitated bats, the drinking of chicken blood. It all plays a part on the dark side of rock and roll. Well, to get us in the mood, who better than Black Sabbath and Paranoid? Staying with lead singer Ozzy Osbourne, he'd left Black Sabbath by the time of this first dark legend. On the 20th of January 1982, Ozzy bit the head off a bat live on stage at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Des Moines, Iowa. During the concert, a fan threw a bat on stage, and thinking it was made of rubber, Ozzy picked up the bat and bit off its head. Well, sadly for the bat, it wasn't rubber, and the bat took a very dim view of this and bit him back. Well, the macabre 27 Club is one of the most enduring rock and roll legends. That's for artists who died at the age of 27. But first, a look at where it all started. Me personally, I take the grand opening of the 27 Club to be the 16th of August 1938 with the death of blues legend Robert Johnson. Now, he only ever wrote and released 29 songs. His last gig, he played in Three Forks near Greenwood, Mississippi, where he's said to have been poisoned by a jealous husband. Well, he's famously, supposedly, gained his genius by selling his soul to the devil. And the meeting took place at the Crossroads. Now, much speculation as to the location of said Crossroads, but if you go to the Crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi of Highway 61 and Highway 49, there's an image of two cross guitars and The Crossroads written below. Jim Morrison was the lead singer of The Doors. Now, they formed in early 65. And in the October of 1970, he was sentenced for lewd and lascivious behaviour for activities at a Miami gig in the March of 69. He got 6 months hard labour and a $500 fine. Well, he lodged an appeal, and while he was awaiting the appeal against his sentence, Jim and his girlfriend Pamela Corson moved to Paris, and it was the 3rd of July 71 where Jim Morrison died over in Paris, supposedly of heart failure, but no autopsy was ever performed. Now, his death is shrouded in mystery and contradiction: where he died, how he died, who he was with when he died. Now, Brian Jones was actually the founding member of the Rolling Stones. He was the first one of them, and he was sacked from his own band just 3 weeks before he died on the 3rd of July 69. And the events surrounding his death have always been shrouded in great controversy. He died around midnight, and he was found dead in his own swimming pool. Well, there were claims that he was murdered, and the Daily Mail, British newspaper, in an article in the August of 2009, it said that police were reviewing Jones's death. New evidence had come to light. Well, I haven't heard anything since then. But probably the strangest of them all, of course, is the death of Jimi Hendrix. He gave his last performance on the 16th of September 1970 when he jammed with Eric Burdon and War at the legendary Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London. Well, he died on the 18th, and his death certificate gave the cause of death, and again in quotes, inhalation of vomit, barbiturate intoxication, brackets, quinylbarbital, insufficient evidence of circumstance, open verdict. Well, he died at his girlfriend's apartment in London, Monica Daneman, or was it in the ambulance? Contradictions in all aspects of his death are rife. The FBI even kept a dossier on Jimmy. Was it suicide? Eric Burdon found the lyrics for his last song, The Story of Life, and he thought that was a suicide note. Was he murdered? One of the authors of a book called Rock Roadie, James Tappy Wright, who was a roadie for Jimmy, in an interview in 2009 at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland, He quite clearly says he's certain that Jimi Hendrix was murdered by his manager, Mike Jeffrey. Was it murder, suicide, accidental overdose? I guess we'll never know. Well, surprisingly, Jimi Hendrix only ever had one American Billboard Top 40 hit, and that only managed to scrape to number 20 in 1968, written by Bob Dylan. This is Jimi Hendrix with All Along the Watchtower. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show, and we're taking a look at the dark side of rock and roll. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Just check out the competition link on my homepage, rockandrollunraveled.com. There's a simple question and you're in the draw. Now, Rock and Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk. Record Collector magazine liked it, and they described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Well, good luck with the competition, and meanwhile, let's get back to the plot. Well, sadly, car crashes have taken far too many rock and roll heroes. Harry Chapin died in New York in a crash in 1981, and Mark Bolan in South London in 1977. Now, supposedly, Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966, but I've already done that one. Paul McCartney is dead myth. Just check out my Mixcloud for all my back shows. Just key in Derek Shelmerdine Mixcloud. Well, nothing sinister about the tragic deaths of Harry Chapin and Mark Bolan. But sometimes, maybe fate takes a hand. Now, on the 7th of October 1966, Johnny Kidd died in a head-on collision. That was near Radcliffe in Lancashire, north of England. And on that fateful night, they'd arrived late for a gig in Bolton. And despite offering to play free of charge, the venue manager cancelled the gig. Well, if he hadn't turned them away, who knows? But interestingly, the bass player at that time was Nick Simper. He was also injured in the crash, and he went on, of course, to become a founding member of Deep Purple. But the strangest of them all has to be Hank Williams. He passed away in the back of his chauffeur-driven Cadillac on the 1st of January 1953. He was on the way to a gig in Canton, Ohio. But after a short but spectacular career, booze finally caught up with the 29-year-old singer-songwriter. Nothing particularly eerie about that. But on the 5th of November 1960, country singer Johnny Horton died in very eerily similar circumstances to Hank Williams. Both had just made what would be their final appearances at the Skyline Club in Austin, Texas. They both left the same widow, Billie Jean. Johnny Horton had married her after Hank Williams' death, and they both died in their cars. Hank Williams passed away peacefully on the back seat of his chauffeur-driven limo, but Horton was the victim of a collision with a drunk driver. In a way, booze killed both men. Well, spookily for Hank Williams and his Drifting Cowboys, they just entered the charts on the 20th of December 52, the country top 40. That was 11 days before he died. Nothing particularly spooky about that. It was his 33rd country top 40 hit. But it was the strangely prophetic title. And this is Hank Williams. I'll never get out of this world alive. We couldn't look at rock and roll's dark side without taking a peek at Phil Spector. Well, he came to prominence very much in the early 60s with his wall of sound. John Lennon had his first collaboration with Spector as producer in the January of 70 with his Instant Karma single. Now, Spector had worked with the Beatles. He transformed their ill-fated Get Back tapes into the swan song album Let It Be. Now, more Spector Lennon collaborations followed Instant Karma, but it was the early part of 1975 when John Lennon came to record his rock and roll album at the time of John Lennon's famous Lost Weekend. Now, the sessions for the rock and roll album proved to be highly volatile, and they eventually fell apart. Now, Phil Spector had paid for the sessions, and he believed he was entitled to the results, so he had it up and away with the tapes. Well, Lennon eventually retrieved the recordings, but he only used 4 of the tracks produced by Spector, and that was, as you can imagine, the last time they worked together. Well, the end of 1977 saw Spector working with Leonard Cohen on his Death of a Ladies' Man album. Again, the recording sessions were apparently shambolic. Spector and Cohen argued about everything. Spector waved a gun around during recording sessions and wouldn't even let Cohen be present at the mixes. And later Cohen described the album as an experiment that failed. Well, in the summer of 1979, the Wall of Sound meets punk. And Spector was working with the Ramones on their End of the Century album. Now, the Ramones typically like to spend as little time as possible in the studio making an album. A typical Ramones album would cost around $60,000. An End of the Century cost $200,000. To put this into context, the recording time was 3 weeks, and the mixing to finished article was 6 months. Now, the original contract was for 2 albums, but neither Spector nor the Ramones could face making another album together. Now, there's a great urban myth about these recording sessions, and the myth says that Phil Spector was waving a gun around a lot. He actually took them hostage for a time. But we'll never really know because accounts vary, even from the band members who were there. But Spector's notoriety peaked at the beginning of 2003 when on the 3rd of February actress Lana Clarkson was found dead at Phil Spector's home, and she had a gunshot wound through the roof of her mouth. Well, Spector was charged with her murder. The first trial ended in September 2007, but the jury failed to reach any agreement. And the second trial, Spector was found guilty, and that was the May of 2009, and given a sentence of 19 years to life. Well, for our next music, I think we'll take a look at Phil Spector meets punk. And this is an original from the Wall of Sound. It was a 64 hit for the Ronettes. And this is the Ramones. Well, it's Phil Spector's idea of what the Ramones sound like with Baby I Love You. British band Badfinger, despite recording on Apple and having singles written by Paul McCartney and produced by George Harrison, sadly, Badfinger had its problems. Pete Ham died at the age of 27 on the 24th of April 1975. He committed suicide 3 days before his 28th birthday. Now, the band was in dispute with their manager Stan Poley over the handling of the group's finances. Well, a lot of bands had problems like this. Now, these problems weighed heavily on Pete Ham. His depression eventually led to suicide, and he hanged himself in his garage. Now, he left a suicide note, and it ended, and I quote, P.S. Stan Poley is a soulless, naughty B-word. I will take him with me. 8 years later, fellow Badfinger songwriter and bassist Tom Evans took his own life. Well, Plane Crashers have taken some of rock and roll's finest to that great gig in the sky, and these are 3 losses with an eerie twist. In the October of 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane crashed with the death of lead vocalist Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines and his sister and vocalist Cassie Gaines. They were flying on to their next gig at Louisiana University in Baton Rouge, and their chartered tour plane crashed, apparently ran out of fuel. But the eerie element was very much the album. The tour was to promote their new album, Street Survivors, released just 3 days earlier. And the original album cover showed the band standing amid burning buildings. Well, after the crash, the record company MCA withdrew the album and replaced the front cover with one of the band standing against a plain black background. Another tragedy suggests that, well, someone might have known something. On the 10th of December 1967, Otis Redding died, actually at the age of 26, in a plane crash in Wisconsin. Redding and the Barkays were due to play that night at the Wisconsin club, The Factory. And this is the strange bit, the support act that night was none other than the Grim Reapers. But fate really stepped in when Buddy Holly died in a plane crash on the 3rd of February 1959. He was on his Winter Dance Party tour, and they'd reached the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. Now, the tour bus was regularly breaking down in sub-zero temperatures, and Holly chartered a light aircraft to fly to Fargo in North Dakota for a concert in nearby Moorhead. Now, Holly's backing musicians were Waylon Jennings and Tommy Alsop, and it was originally intended that they'd be on the flight with him. But Waylon Jennings gave up his seat for the big bopper, J.P. Richardson, and Richie Valens won, if you can call it that, the flip of a coin and took Tommy Alsop's seat. Well, the plane took off shortly after midnight and crashed a few miles outside Clear Lake. Now, the Stones do a brilliant version of this on the 1965 album Out of Our Heads, but this is Otis Redding with That's How Strong My Love Is. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock and Roll Unravelled show with a look at the darker side of rock and roll. Now, lots of bands and artists mentioned in the show have concert dates in the diary. To see the latest tour info, dates and venues, check out my website, rockandrollunravel.com. Look at the top and you'll see 1960s, 70s artists touring now. See which of your favourite artists and bands who started out in the 60s and 70s have gigs in the diary. Well, back to the story. On Christmas Day 1954, rising R&B star Johnny Ace sadly died. He was just 25 years old, and that was at a gig at the City Auditorium in Houston, Texas. Big Mama Thornton was also on that particular bill. And during a backstage break, he was playing a game of Russian roulette that went tragically wrong. Well, Charles Manson, as well as being a notorious serial killer, was a wannabe rock and roll star. Though contrary to persisting urban myth, he didn't actually audition for the Monkees. Manson's pop ambitions took a giant leap after Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson befriended him. Manson and his so-called family even lived with Dennis for a while, and Manson made some recordings in Brian Wilson's home studio. In the summer of '68, the Beach Boys recorded a track called Never Learn Not to Love. And this was actually a track written by Charles Manson that he'd called Cease to Exist. That track, Never Learn Not to Love, was the B-side of their December '68 single Bluebirds Over the Mountain, and it also appeared early in '69 on their 2020 album. But the relationship ended after the mass murders by Charles Manson and the so-called family of Sharon Tate and Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Actress Sharon Tate and 4 other people were murdered on the 9th of August '69. Now, Manson wasn't actually at that particular event. The following night, this time Charles Manson was there with some of the family members. They broke into the LA home of the LaBiancas and both were viciously stabbed to death. The husband had the word war carved into his flesh. Rise and death to pigs were written in blood on the walls, and a misspelled Helter Skelter was written in blood on the refrigerator door. Now, the messages written in blood have all been tied to tracks on the Beatles' White Album, Piggies, Helter Skelter, Revolution 9. And Manson perceived these songs to contain messages warning of an upcoming race war by the name of Helter Skelter. Revolution 9 seen very much as a reference to the apocalyptic biblical prophecies in Revelations chapter 9. Well, this is that reworked version of Charles Manson's Cease to Exist. And from the Beach Boys 2020 album, this is Never Learn Not to Love. Heavy metal, often described as the devil's music, has associations with Satanism, satanic imagery. Now, 2 metal bands actually ended up in court after it was claimed that their albums were responsible for some suicides. Firstly, we look at Black Sabbath, early metal pioneers, took their name from a 1963 Boris Karloff movie. They formed in '69 by lead singer Ozzy Osbourne. He left in '78. Well, in late '79, Ozzy Osbourne formed Blizzard of Oz with Randy Rhoads, guitarist, and Bob Daisley, bass. And in September of 1980, they released Blizzard of Oz, and that was the first album for Ozzy since leaving Black Sabbath. And one of the tracks was called Suicide Solution, actually written by Osbourne, Rhoads and Daisley. And that led to a lawsuit after Californian teenager John McCullum shot and killed himself in 1984. McCullum had listened to a number of albums, but it was the song Suicide Solution that singled out when McCullum's parents brought a lawsuit against Ozzy and CBS. The parents' action failed. The court decided that Osbourne's music not responsible for the young man's death. But it wasn't just Aussie who evoked demons. In 1978, Judas Priest released their Stained Class album, and Rolling Stone puts that at number 43 on their best 100 metal albums list. Well, almost 7 years after its release, Judas Priest, and again their record company Columbia, was sued by parents of two American fans who claimed that subliminal messages contained in the songs triggered a suicide pact. Raymond Belknap and James Vance decided to kill themselves with a shotgun after listening to Judas Priest's Stained Class for hours on end. Well, Raymond Belknap actually succeeded, but James Vance only managed to blow away the bottom half of his face, leaving him severely disfigured. Well, the track singled out as the catalyst for this episode was the cover of Spooky Tooth's Better By You, Better Than Me, written by Gary Wright. It was alleged that the track contained the subliminal message, do it, do it, do it. Anyway, 5 years later, the case was settled in the band's favour. Well, don't go near the shotgun cabinet. With their Spooky Tooth cover and possible subliminal messages, this is Judas Priest, and Better By You, Better Than Me. Be very wary of any invitation from Harry Nilsson to stay at his London apartment. This singer-songwriter and John Lennon drinking buddy's flat has seen some very sudden, very unexpected deaths. The first was Mama Cass Elliot, as she started out in the Mugwumps and the Big Three, not to be confused with the Liverpool Big Three, of course, and then found international fame with the Mamas and the Papas. By 1974, she was pursuing a solo career, and she was in London for a 2-week engagement at the London Palladium. And on the 29th of July, sadly, Mama Cass died at the age of 32 in Harry Nilsson's apartment. Now, there's an urban myth that she choked on a ham sandwich. The reality is that she died of a heart attack, and the death certificate gives the reason as, and I quote, fatty myocardial degeneration due to obesity. Natural causes. Well, 4 years later, tragedy struck again at Harry Nilsson's abode. On the 6th of September 1978, The Who's drummer Keith Moon attended a film preview of the Buddy Holly story with his friend Paul McCartney, and after dining out with Paul and Linda, with his girlfriend Annette Walter Lax, he uncharacteristically returned home early. Well, sadly, the following day Keith Moon died, and that was from an accidental overdose of tablets. Ironically, he was taking to combat alcoholism. The coroner found no evidence of intention and returned an open verdict. Well, our final look at the dark side concerns the sad fate of a chicken at an Alice Cooper gig. And that was the 13th of September 1969 at the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival. Now, in Alice Cooper's normal act, the band would explode some feather pillows and shower the audience with feathers. Well, in Toronto, someone threw a live chicken on stage. And believing that a bird with wings, well, it can fly, Alice Cooper threw the bird into the audience, believing it would simply fly away. Sadly, it didn't, and the audience tore it to pieces. The following day, it was reported that Alice Cooper had bitten the head off a live chicken and drunk its blood. Well, Frank Zappa had recently signed Alice Cooper to his new Straight label, and he heard about this and telephoned Cooper to ask if it was true. And Cooper replied that it wasn't, and Zappa reputedly suggested, keep that information to yourself. The publicity, absolutely priceless. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show, and a look at the darker side of rock and roll. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show, half as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, please hook up. You can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled. Join me again next time for another look at some rock and roll unravelled. Well, to play us out, now this is a big hit for Alice Cooper on both sides of the Atlantic in 1989. And what else but Alice Cooper's Poison.